Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Gary Parker. I'm the Associate Dean for External Affairs and the Director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute at the Brown School at Washington University in St. Louis, and welcome to our COVID and Race series. In response to the multitude of ways in which COVID-19 has disproportionately affected communities of color and the increased social movement demanding that Black Lives Matter, the Brown School and the Clark Fox Policy Institute organized this series to elevate the voices of local leaders, researchers, advocates, and activists. And we hope this series will serve as a platform highlighting multiple perspectives and draw on community-based and evidence-based knowledge to address the challenges facing Black, Brown, and Native people. The speakers and participants will share their insights on the scope of the issues, the root causes, and recommendations for advancing racial and health equity. And this is part 6 in our series, How to Talk to Kids About Race and Social Justice. I'm going to put a link in the chat feature that will take you to the previous parts of the COVID and Race series. I think you'll find some really interesting conversations there that you will enjoy. I want to thank Cynthia Williams, Atia Thurman, and Janet Gillow, who are my partners in crime in producing these events. I'm so grateful to have their thought partnership and to help me kind of organize behind the scenes. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to our co-moderators. Of course, we have our moderator, Atia Thurman, who's the Associate Director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. And we also have Jason Heiser. Did I say that right?
It's Heiser.
Heiser, thank you. Head of Schools at Crossroads College Preparatory High School. I want to say that right, Jason, because it deserves it. So let's hand it over to our moderators, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Gary. As Gary said, I'm Atia Thurman, Associate Director of the Clark Fox Policy Institute. And today I'm so excited. I can't tell you, I'm breaking from protocol here because there's so many amazing people that we've had the chance to engage with during this entire series. But this really is a panel of some of my beloved. So I have to just give a shout out to how outstanding this panel is. We are facing a dual crisis. Some of us may say we may be facing 3 or 4 crises. Either way, our nation and our globe is in turmoil over the coronavirus pandemic. Along with it, though, police violence has really ignited a new movement around anti-racism and the awareness of racism. So it's igniting discussions about race and racism in households worldwide. Families find themselves grappling with difficult conversations, and adults are looking for guidance on how to engage children, especially as they challenge their own biases, their own prejudices, their own behaviors, intentional or not, that may sustain racism. Many parents recognize that this moment is really critical opportunity for families to consider their role, their responsibility, and their commitment in advancing racial equity. And they're looking for resources and support. And we have an outstanding panel today of parents, educators, entrepreneurs, advocates, who are joining together to just share their expertise, to share their experiences and their insights, talking, not just talking about race with children, but raising children with a racial equity lens. At this point, it's my honor to turn the conversation over to my co-moderator, Jason, to introduce himself.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Heiser. I am head of school for Crossroads College Prep, a small independent school in the city of St. Louis. We have a strong mission commitment to justice and equity, and I'm really honored to be a part of this group today, to have folks reach out and be thoughtful about this in terms of how it affects our students and how it affects our families. I think is really useful. I know that parents, white parents particularly, have been reaching out to me frequently about how do we have these conversations, and then how do we deal with the emotions that come up in us as adults about unprocessed things about our own racial bias, about our own upbringing, about micro affirmations or micro punishments we might have received as we were growing up and being racialized. I've been saying frequently that by the time we know we are white, we've already been made white. And so being here together to think well about how to do this and how to affect our current situation and how to change our world is really useful. So I'm super happy to be here and to learn as well on behalf of my community. So I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. So just take a moment to let us know kind of what brings you here today, and we'd be happy to have you just begin, or I can call on who's ever next to me. I'll call on Alex because I don't actually, this is the first time I'll have met Alex. So why don't we start with you, Alex?
Well, thank you, Jason. I'm Alec Stalling, Director of Early Learning at 9 Network. And with PBS, we have a bank of resources around talking about these topics. And I've had professional experience around facilitation with these topics as well. Pleased to be here.
Thank you, Alex. Adelaide, will you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Adelaide Lancaster. I am a mom to 3 kids, an almost 10-year-old, 8-year-old, and 6-year-old. They are all white children. I am the co-founder and executive director for an organization called We Stories. And our purpose is really to engage and activate white families in the work of racial justice. And so we have programs that are designed especially to help them open up and start and strengthen conversations about race and racism, and do much of the work that you were just referencing, Jason, right? So come for the kids, but realize that it's actually about starting with yourself and unpacking your own journey and experiences in order to be a better parent, as is all true with all things parenting. And my family has lived in St. Louis for 8 years. And prior to that, I grew up on the East Coast, which I mention only because I'm sure we'll talk about socialization at some point. And that's an important part of my journey, and recognizing sort of where I came from and the messages I received. Yeah, thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Oh, we're glad to have you. And Heather, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, my name is Heather Fleming. First and foremost, I am the mother of 3 wonderful children who are almost 24 this month, 18 and 12. And so I myself grew up in St. Charles, Missouri. And as we talk about socialization, that will have an impact. But I ended up going away to college at Truman State University, a PWI, and then I came back here. I went back to school in UMSL and became a teacher, got my teacher certification, became a teacher, and now I've taught for 15 years total, until I decided to leave and begin my own nonprofit doing equity work around the St. Louis area. And so we hold webinars and things so that we can teach parents exactly these types of things. We also talk to people about some of the ideas that Adia mentioned, and also that Gary mentioned, as far as how do we deal with some of this stuff? How do we do it? And just the nuts and bolts of doing it. I also, in that time, I've authored a book, My Black Friend Says, Lessons in Equity, Inclusion, and Cultural Competency. And yeah, just been getting out there doing the work, meeting people, and trying to teach them that, yes, this is hard work, but it is so very worth it. So thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Heather. When I think about someone I look up to when it comes to anti-racist teaching and leading and work, I think of Mary Ferguson. So I'm super excited to see you, Mary, and I invite you to introduce yourself today. Thanks,
Jason. I'm delighted to join these other women that have great backgrounds and experiences to bring to the discussion. I come as someone who's a native St. Louisan and almost lifelong St. Louisan. I did 5 years away from St. Louis, which is always a good way to get more perspective on the place that you grew up. I am a parent. I'm probably the oldest parent in the group. So I have a 41-year-old daughter. I am white and she is mixed heritage. So I raised a daughter who identifies as Black. And luckily, because she's 41, I also talked to her about what this panel was going to be about. So she was willing to give her input as well through me. The work that I do now that many people have interacted with me around the community is I'm the Racial Justice Director for the YWCA. And in that role, administer our Witnessing Whiteness program and our other programs. Another thing I want you to know about my background is I am an educator. And so I think about young people from the perspective of their life in the home, in the community, and in the schools where they're interacting with their peers and the adults around them. And I think that's a really important sense of two lenses that I bring to thinking about young people.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. Mary's a good friend of mine. I told you this panel is made up of our beloved. This is quite a circle right here.
Yes.
So Adelaide, you and Heather both sort of already previewed a little bit of our first question, which this is a very personal topic, to be honest. So we're going to get a little personal, and we're going to ask you. You can answer either question, any of you, but the first is just how has the dual crisis of the pandemic and then, police violence sort of motivating a new civil rights movement? How has that changed conversations about race in your home or among the stakeholders that you serve? And then we're going to ask you a little bit about how was race discussed during your upbringing in the homes of your origin, and how do you think that has shaped your adult view?
Either you want to go first or you want me to go first?
I can jump in. First, when the pandemic first hit, of course, everything that I was doing came to a halt because everything was in person. And so once the pandemic hit, I think that everyone was just trying to figure it out. But then what we had an opportunity to see was that even though there were things that stopped because there was no longer a pandemic, so we didn't have mass shootings, we didn't have school shootings. There's just a lot of stuff ended because everyone was trying to socially distance and be in their home, etc. The one thing that didn't end was racism and the impact of racism. And so with George Floyd's death, it was like a new awakening for people. And it's not necessarily that the information wasn't there. It's just that I don't know exactly what hit differently with George Floyd, but it just did. And it spurred people to action. And so most of the contacts that I received from people at that point were just simply, I know I need to do something. I don't know what it is. And so that's where my role comes in, because I'm the person that my whole goal when I was teaching, we used to have diversity training and things all the time. And it just always felt like it was missing something. And one of the biggest things that it was missing, well, there were a couple of things. One thing that it did a lot of times is that the training required people to perform, Black people to perform our pain in front of white people so that, white people could learn from it and try to empathize with it. And I just always thought that's unfair, because if you are in a work environment, one of the things that you try to do as a Black person is to, I don't want to say blend into the work environment, but you're trying your best to put on the mask that allows you to be acceptable, I would say, that allows you to be non-threatening, that allows you to be all of these things, and to kind of step away from some of the stereotypes so that your expertise, so that your abilities can be front and foremost, And so I always had a problem with that, because when you did those types of things, sometimes you had administrators, you had people that ask you, what is your opinion on this? What is your truth in this area? But when you gave that truth, there were consequences for it, And so I've always kind of shied away from that in training. But then the other thing that it didn't do is that it kept assuming that all people were at a certain point and so ready for this training, and it missed that middle point where it's like, we're not, that's not it. And so that became kind of my goal, is to teach people that we're in that middle point where, okay, I know there's something that needs to happen, but I don't know how to do it. And so that's what I ended up starting to do. I think that how the conversations changed in my household is that, we've always talked about race on a regular basis. It's something that touches our lives every day. And so when George Floyd happened, there was a grief process in my home. And so the first thing that I had to do was to guide my children, and to a certain extent my husband, through that grief process that I myself was also feeling. So the conversations changed in terms of really trying to hit on why we were grieving so very hard over this man's death, what it brought back when we thought about all of the other deaths that we had received, how to deal with the gap in the middle between being angry that it took another man to die for people to begin saying, oh, there's a problem, when there's been so much evidence before, but then also being happy about the fact that people were finally getting on board and seeing that, yes, there's a problem, something needs to happen, we need to do something, we've got to change things. It can't just be like last time where people get angry, we do a few protests, and then we move on until the next step. And so I think that that's been how the conversations have changed in our family. Adelaide.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, sorry, I was really paying attention to what you were saying. So I grew up in a house that did not talk about race publicly, and I'm trying to be more honest about that, because I have most often said I grew up in a house that didn't really talk about race. But when I think about it more honestly, we did talk about race privately, but we didn't talk about race publicly. So it was shushed in the public domain, and we don't really talk about that, and it was a lot about what's polite. And what can be public. But I did get tons of racialized messages that were more explicit at home. I think I know they were really full of bias. They were also just really full of confusion, right? So my parents didn't have a very sophisticated lens on racial inequity and to be able to look at systems. So what I mostly remember were either biased comments, or when the world felt confusing, which it often did, not being able to get like a clear answer or hear anything that made sense. And so I heard a lot of messages of like, it just kind of is that way, right? Like some people are gonna have, some people are gonna have not, like things are just the way they are, which gave me a lot of impression that there was nothing to be done about it, right? And so if I had an empathetic response, or if I would express something about injustice, I was just sort of like informed, like, just be glad you're not in that situation, is basically what I felt like I heard. And also a lot of conflation between what is an individual choice and what is systemically ordained. So I'm glad that you asked these two questions together, because I think that this moment, more than anything for my particular family, gives me the most accurate measuring stick to know that what I'm doing in my home is so radically different than what I experienced growing up. And also so radically different from nearly 6 years ago when Michael Brown was killed. For my family, that was when we started a lot of our conversations. And so we've been able to talk, even at my kids' ages, 10, 8, and 6, about the systemic layers. We have lost 2 preschool teachers that are women of color that were important to my family. It's been really hard and personal, and we've been able to talk about that. So I think acknowledging who has medical supplies, who doesn't have medical supplies, who's being taken care of, who isn't being taken care of, who's being asked to put themselves at risk, and really being able to keep race as part of that analysis is only possible because we've been having a conversation, for many years. The last thing I will just say, because Heather, you graciously shared how your family grieved and processed the death of George Floyd is that when I told my children, I started by saying, I have some really sad news to share, and they knew already what I was going to say. And it was 2 weeks after we had really had a robust conversation about the death of Ahmaud Arbery, right? And so I just, I'm super aware that they are having a very different experience and exposure, and I'm hoping that that can lead to, a lifelong action and engagement and not putting those blinders on. But I think that that's what this moment has meant most for my family personally.
If I could build on what Adelaide mentioned about your upbringing, and mine was a different generation, but I think the same idea of perhaps empathy or at least expressions of trying to understand situations that were not our own. But I think the difference that I heard in discussing this with my daughter was it wasn't the talk, it was the action that followed the empathy. And so she said, I asked her specifically for what kind of conversations did we had? What words do you remember? And her response was, and I agreed with her, that action and the environment are two things that made the biggest difference to her. Being in a home where she remembered this, the St. Louis American was there every week. It was part of how we connected to the outside world. Her memory of doing chores on Saturday was you put Patti LaBelle or Aretha Franklin on so that we would be moving and cleaning at the same time. The artists, the books, the part of my introduction, I didn't say I'm co-founder of an organization, the North St. Louis Arts Council. Started over 30 years ago. And so we had a lot of arts in our life, and she knew the arts community from a variety of perspectives. But then she talked about the actions that she remembered we took and places we went and things we did and things I did. I worked for St. Louis Public Schools at the time that the DSEG program was in full effect. And she wanted to know why, when I went to Walbridge School and she went with me in Walnut Park, it looked like it did, but the school around the corner from us looked different. So we had a lot of conversations, but they were related to our movement in and out. And the other thing that she said was so significant to her was my circle of friends was diverse. These were adults who would talk to her and engage her as a young person. They were in our home. She felt close to them, and she had, especially me as a white woman raising a child of color, I wanted her to see that she was part of a larger community. My family is pretty unusual in that it's multinational, multi-religious, multi-ethnic. So she did see some things, but it's still primarily white. I have 5 white siblings, and she had a lot of white cousins. And then she had other cousins who were from other identity groups. But she wanted to see that that was my world too. And I think she did. And that, I think, made a big difference and gave us lots and lots of talking points.
So as I've listened to the three of you speak, I keep thinking about just the complexities of talking about race. And as a parent, like, how do you navigate the complexities of this? And so I wonder if our panelists could share a little bit about the value of talking about race, when and to what degree or intensity it is important to begin talking about race, and then what are some barriers? So I know that's like a multi-part question, but what I'm trying to get at is, given all that the panelists shared so far, how do you navigate all of those complexities now in a way that is meaningful and useful and impactful for your families in terms of value when to start the conversation and to what intensity and what barriers there are to it.
Yeah, I'd be glad to jump in, Jason, on that, because what we're talking about is our foundational experiences. And so the foundational experiences are the building blocks, and it is so essential that those messages start early and that are reinforced, because what we're dealing with on the systemic level is the counter messages. So as children are growing, they're hearing negative feedback, they're hearing pieces around race, and they're getting those perspectives. So it's so important to have it instilled already around identity, around understanding, around embracing who you are, and really have the language for it. So when you hear something that is not helpful to you as a child, that you already have those messages, you have the affirmation built in. And that's really the part that I wanted to bring to the conversation around upbringing, is really around affirmations and excellence, ideas around, so in our Black household, it would be around Black excellence and around success, around achievement, around, we had afternoons where we watched Sidney Poitier and we talked about how he was just groundbreaking as an actor and what these scenes meant and all of that. And so later, when other counter narratives were there, or things were missing in textbooks, or people weren't present, that content was already there. That foundation was already there for us to lean on. And there's a TED Talk that is just so essential that has not been brought up in this thread of conversation around race and racism, but the danger of a single story. And it's really, really, that's what we're dealing with here. So if children only hear one lens, if only hear one perspective, and as we talked about the parent capability, if parents are only comfortable speaking in one way around topics or speaking with certain groups, then that's going to come across with their children. So we've already said that it's the work Adelaide mentioned about the internal work of the parents. Connecting our two issues right now, we have to put our mask on first. We have to make sure that we're clear around communicating to children so that they have a solid foundation to build upon.
I echo all of what you just shared, Alex, and I would just add that as a parent of white children, I think it's very easy, because of the way that whiteness is often treated, to come to a conversation about race or make space to talk about race and only talk about other people, right, in white spaces. And so I think that has been a place that I've had to, I mean, at this point, I feel like my whole life is about remedial education and filling in the history I didn't know and the experiences I don't understand and everything that felt confusing before, and then trying to figure out how to make that more accessible to my children at an earlier stage, so they don't have to spend their 30s and 40s bemoaning mistakes made in the past or missed opportunities, wondering about the harm that they've caused, right? And like being able to engage and work for change earlier. In addition to emphasizing the counter narratives and focusing on Black excellence and naming it and naming stereotypes and looking for filling in those stories, it is incumbent on us to also say, we are racial beings. We have a race. We play a very significant role in all these stories. We're not learning about others' histories and then just saying, like, from a distance, like, how interesting, how neat, you know? So we are constantly saying, what role did we play in that? Where were we? What is our responsibility? And noticing, right, when we're in all white spaces, race is very present. And so that has been an additional piece that I'm grateful to live in St. Louis doing that, because I feel very well supported here as a parent doing that because of all the work that's represented on this panel. But I think that is a piece we're collectively still learning how to do well and appropriately.
I'd like to make a point about schools. I don't know if this is the exact moment to do it, but I know I have people in this group who understand this and can reinforce if I don't handle it well enough. It is difficult for young people to move from home where these conversations do flow and they feel natural and they are treated as part of how we are together, and then moving into an environment where even talking about race is seen as racist sometimes by adults themselves who haven't done the work. And so I'd like for us all to think about our roles as parents and the roles that brings with us into the education sphere, because I often have worked with schools and I've taught teachers, and I hear a lot about, I can't do that because the parents will be afraid or the parents won't want it. And yet I always encounter parents like you all who say, yes, we should be doing this. So how do we get those countervailing voices into education? How do we support teachers and other adults who want to continue those conversations with our young people? You know, run for school board yourself is one thing that I tell people. Be on curriculum committees and be that parent volunteer. Be a voice in the schools. And I know Atia's shaking her head because I know she's been doing that work with her own son in his school district. But there's so many ways as parents that we can advocate for this to be just beyond our bubble of our family in our house doing this work, connecting them and letting them see its bigger work, and that we have other people who will carry this. Sometimes we can't carry it and we need to step back and someone else can carry it for a while. So I think that idea of the relationship between home and school and the critical work we play, the critical role we play as parents in both places.
There's oh, I'm sorry.
No, go for it, Heather. Go for it.
You know, in the end, we also have to acknowledge the privilege that is within the question of when do you start talking to your kids about race, because I didn't have that choice. My parents didn't have that choice. I was called the N-word for the first time in 2nd grade, and I had to run home and ask my mom what it meant. And once they explained what it meant, you know, of course, I was devastated. I felt very lucky when my daughter got all the way to 5th grade before she was called the N-word, okay? And so that ends up being some of the work that we need to think about, because I had to start early talking to my kids about race. You know, I'm taking my children to play somewhere and I'm watching kids that, you know, are like, I'm not going to play with this girl because she's different. I'm not going to play with that boy because he's different. And so having to explain to my children things like there are going to be people that don't like you simply because of your skin color. So we start very early talking about race, and we start at, you know, some basic stuff, but we do start from a point of positivity as far as Black and brown people are concerned. But in answer to what Adelaide was saying, one of the things that I think we fail to do in general is to also teach about whiteness. And so we have, you know, parents and teachers and, you know, et cetera, that are teaching about other without teaching that whiteness is also something too. And in most of my training, that's a point that I bring forward, because if we all had a better understanding of whiteness and the fact that, you know, yeah, there are some things and habits that come along with it, then you could also understand its impact on me as a Black person, or its impact on, you know, if we talk about what it is to be Christian in America, we can understand better what it is to be Muslim, you know, and to be considered other. And so it's just one of those things, we have to examine all of the identities in the room if we're really going to get to the best understanding. And then in response to Dr. Ferguson, I experienced those same things as an educator. I had students taken out of my class because I talked about Black stuff too much. You know, students taken out of my class because I chose to do this novel by a Black author rather than that novel by, you know, one of the traditional dead white guys. And but that was fine because we still have to have that ability to incorporate multicultural viewpoints, et cetera, you know. And I'll never forget when I first began teaching, how many teachers came up to me, especially when I began in my predominantly white district, how many teachers and people came up to me and told me how good I was going to be for the Black kids. And I had to let them know, no, I'm good for all kids, because all kids need to see people like me in their classrooms. And it was just a shame that in the district I'm in, it's probably more progressive than a lot of the districts in the area, but I still was too many kids first Black teacher. And I taught high school. So I was too many kids first Black teacher. I was too many kids only Black teacher throughout their entire 12, 13 years of school. And so we just have to look at all the ways that we are kind of handicapping kids and handicapping these conversations from happening in safe spaces in the way that they need to happen.
And I so appreciate Mary bringing that up, and what you said, Heather, in the chapters of my professional life that have now built to where I am. I started in the classroom, and being a graduate of a magnet SLPS school, I knew our canon, which was colorful canon. So I came ready to deliver that to a predominantly white institution, and had parent objections to things like letter from Birmingham jail.
Right.
Like this isn't even outside of the canon. Like I'm still working within who we know and typically would bring into a classroom, but I do completely value that idea of pressing around districts, training, and perspectives for teachers.
I think one of the biggest things that it really brings forward, though, is that when people ask, what could I be doing? There's so much. We have so many places where we have to disrupt that it really depends on what's your realm of influence, and how within your realm of influence can you make changes necessary to make the atmosphere to where we are. Like I said, in Hamilton, you guys know I'm obsessed with Hamilton right now. And like Adelaide brought up, this is not a moment, it's a movement. And so we're in it for the long haul. This is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. And so what we need to start thinking about is, where can I, do it? If your role isn't to be in the streets protesting, that's okay. Where can you disrupt these cycles? Because you have power within your own areas of influence. So use it.
I want to, man, this is so rich. I know we could go forever. I want to bring in, I heard so many different things, but the thing I want to bring in is the fear. I heard a little bit about the fear from parents or educators or both, because parents and educators are really partners in raising children. We have to embrace that partnership. And I heard a fear around race and racism, talking about it, embracing it, confronting it, because we're not. And I think a lot of times when I hear parents push back or educators push back, is that they're shielding themselves. They think they're shielding children, and they're shielding themselves from their own discomfort. And I want to ask you personally, what are the things you think that parents and educators can do to prepare themselves for this work? What is the individual work they need to do to prepare themselves to engage children? I know you're laughing, Heather, because it's so much, right? It's a lifetime of work.
That's
I know.
Such a huge question. It's a huge question. I look at people like Adelaide and Dr. Ferguson and Alex that, they know the reality, which is that you're going to learn something new every single day. So the first thing that has to happen is for you to get into a space where you're realizing that you need to learn. I tell people all the time, if you plan on being an anti-racist, if you plan on really being in this work, the first thing that you really have to learn, number one, is how to process internally before you ever say a word, before you ever do any work. In my book, I actually have, I call it the MILA, and it's like mind, investigate, listen, learn, and then act. And so those are all of the things before you even say a word that you have to be able to do. Why are you feeling the way that you're feeling? What has brought about those feelings? What else do you need to listen to and learn so that you can better act? So there's that part of it. But then the other thing that I tell people, learn how to apologize. Because the first thing that you also need to accept is that you're going to mess up. And so that is another fear that keeps people sometimes for going all out and doing the work, is that they're scared that, oh my goodness, I am going to end up offending someone, and then I'm going to be labeled racist, and then blah, 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 blah. Being labeled racist should not be the fear. The fear should be being racist. And so if you're able to sit and to work through it and to decide, Dr. Maya Angelou has the most beautiful quote, and I say it all the time. I did then what I knew how to do. When I knew better, I did better. And again, that's the expectation. So that's the work you have to do, is here's some things I need to start on internally. And then once I get to the internal part, once I learn what to do when I mess up, now let's jump into it. But all of that stuff, it's like you're going to be building the airplane as it's up in the air, as you're flying it. So you're going to jump into the work, and you need to jump into the work. But at the same time, also you need to continue to learn and continue to build your airplane into a better vehicle. Oh, someone asked the question, it's Mila, M-I-L-L-A, but the name of my book is My Black Friend Says, Lessons in Equity, Inclusion, and Cultural Competency. So, all right, I'll let everybody else talk.
Oh, I want to add on to what you're saying, if that's okay, just to say why that was hard for me, because I think that is absolutely what is true for me, is really embracing a learning mindset, which sounds like real, I don't know, fine, easy, like embrace a learning mindset. That was really, that was a significant shift. And to your point, Mary, and how you've been talking about the role of education, I was educated in schools that talked to me, made the presumption, these are the future leaders of America. You are fabulous just for just for sitting in the seat, right? Just for being here. There just so many messages of entitlement, right? And value and worth, and that's what whiteness does. But I wasn't able to see that that was what was happening. So just the idea that I could learn about something easily and quickly, even though I hadn't experienced it, and then come up with like a lot of ideas and then fix something and getting, you know, and so all of that is how I was conditioned, and I've needed to put all of that to the side to say, like, all I know is my experience. I need to forever learn outside of my experience and keep asking, what can I do? What can I do? What can I do? Or how do I best show up in the sphere of influence the way that Heather was. And I think that my biggest piece of advice for parents who are wondering about how to do this is to narrate more. So not parent talk to your kids, but narrate. And Mary was talking about, I mean, everybody's actually talked about, Alex, you were talking about modeling too, but I'm going to a talk tonight because I don't know very much about this and I want to learn more. It's really important. I'm reading this book because it feels really important. I don't feel like I know enough. I didn't know enough when I was growing up, like modeling the learning and narrating what you're doing and why and how you're spending your time and why it matters to you as a white person for white parents has been really, that gives my kids the permission to approach it similarly.
Speaking to the fear, I have heard that a lot. I've heard that come up around either fear of being labeled or just fear. It is about finding your safe space, whatever your safe space is defined as. So if you've been having these conversations a long time, your safe space may look more like support, like a support group, a venting session. But if this is a newer territory for you, Atia, you'd ask about what links to share. And the reason that I chose the one that I did from PBS Parents was that as you scroll down, there's different entry points. So if you're ready to talk to your child directly, you start there. But if that's not your safe space, if that does have apprehension, then you can scroll down and find other entry points. And Adelaide, you mentioned about learning and unlearning. and part of this is that piece. Like what else, if I feel some kind of apprehension, what is it about what I don't know? Because usually it's fear of the unknown. So what do I need to learn more about? What can I lean in and ask about? People are finding safe spaces in book clubs and all different kinds of discussion points. And so the most important thing about it is that it's like that tagline, feel the fear and do it anyway. Be brave, be brave. Because this is that time. And to mention Hamilton, Heather, we don't want to miss this opportunity. We don't want to miss this is
let's not miss our shot.
the shot, because none of this is going away unless we lean in.
So we acknowledge that we've got about 15 minutes left in this conversation, and so we want to. I know, right, Heather? This could be like a half-day workshop, and
I love talking to brilliant
more
people.
I know. One of the things I just want to add to the conversation, having been in this space, is what I ask adults to do is to listen. I ask them to stop for a minute, to acknowledge their privilege, to acknowledge their own upbringing and socialization to themselves, to reflect, keep a journal. I mean, keep a journal, write down something every day. I know Jason says this. I'd love to hear from Jason. Jason cares for a whole school of young people and their parents. And the other thing I want them to do is to, learn how to listen to people. If you don't have a diverse circle, personally, if you don't have Black, brown lives in your personal circle, there's a lot. Thank God for technology. There's a lot of ways you can listen to the experience and the stories of Black and brown people right now. There are podcasts and there are entire series and there are documentaries and Netflix is, I hate to start with Netflix. Start with a book or a podcast, please. But there is some great resources right now. Listen to the experiences and the stories of people who've had a different experience than you, and acknowledge. One of the biggest things I need for people to do right now in this awakening is to acknowledge not just their own personal space, their own personal identity, and their personal privilege. Acknowledge the history of structural racism, acknowledge colonialism, and acknowledge the harm to our entire society and nation by a history of racism, and that permeates everything, our entire culture. One of our parents in the chat, I have to tell you guys, this is, like I said, I think Gary said this was our 7th conversation out of like 10. Yeah. I don't think I've ever seen this many comments in the chat. So I have to get to the chat. Somebody asked really early on, how do we bridge this conversation around race to justice? And so if anyone wants to talk about bridging this to a conversation about justice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to just say a little bit. I think that something I think a lot about is institutions that may have the ability to say, we've talked about race for a long time. Like, we've been having conversations and nothing has changed, and they're not wrong. And so then I'm often wondering, well, what has been missing from those conversations? And so I think about the whiteness piece that we've talked about earlier, and I think about the justice piece, right? And so often we stop at appreciating each other's differences and appreciation, and we aren't putting power and disparate outcomes into the equation, right? Yes. And so it's not just that we are different, it's that we treat people differently, create systems that continually treat people differently, and then don't ever do anything to rectify because the same people are in power, right? And so there are ways to that kids can understand that, right? And so that's when and that is the most clarifying and helpful piece for me to better understand the world that I live in, that gives me lots of opportunities to wonder about experiences that aren't mine. If I'm not having a conversation about justice, then I'm really not understanding, the world or the system, that I'm living in. So I think that's often missing. Atia.
I think that to go along with that, when I do my anti-racism webinar and training, the biggest thing that I really stress is that the role of the anti-racist is not to change hearts and minds. It is to change systems. And so people, when you have a better grasp of what that means, I think that you are more aware again of what your real work is, because the other stuff is performative. It's great, but it becomes performative if you just focused on hearts and minds, you know, and we just focus on, oh, all of us feel better now. It's not better if we haven't changed the systems that continue to produce these inequitable outcomes for Black and Brown people. And we have to look at, the other thing that I've realized is that not many people truly understand what racism is. It's a word that they throw around, but they don't truly understand what it is. A lot of people think of it as like this little, it really is the tip of the iceberg, you know, that part where it's the KKK, it's lynching, it's, you know, the Holocaust, it's all these really egregious acts, okay? They don't realize that that's just a small percentage of racism. And the biggest pieces of racism that we have to deal with are the reasonable oppression, those things that we accept as okay, because it's how we've been socialized into it. And so that it ends up being the fact that resources are being hoarded in white communities and in white schools, et cetera. That, you know, there's a $23 billion educational funding gap between schools that are predominantly white and schools that are predominantly Black. That's what we're trying to change. So we can integrate the schools and have, you know, dual dances between a predominantly white school and predominantly Black school. We could do all that stuff, that's great. But how do we get it to where that $23 billion that's in the gap is now more equitably distributed amongst different groups? So there's just a lot of work that needs to be done, and we need to make sure that that work is not performative in nature, that we're really doing what we're supposed to do, which is change the systems, not just try to create circumstances where hearts and minds can be changed. There's some hearts and minds that will never be changed. But what I want is for them not to be able to take their personal feelings into the systems and use that to deny my children, you know, a good education, to deny them the opportunity to progress and advance in the same way that other children of equal capabilities would be able to. Yeah. I have lots of friends. There's some people on here that I'm good friends with. I love them. We go to dinner, we have fun, you know, or meet for lunch. That's great. So I don't need more people to like me. I need you not to be able to discriminate against me.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to change. We need to focus on that.
Yeah, when we talk about advancing racial equity, we're talking about outcomes. So as much as I love that we're taking down statues and flags, I really want the outcome. I want the outcome to be different for Black males. I have a 16-year-old, beautiful, brilliant Black man. I want the outcome of his life to be different. I don't want the outcome to be predicted by who thinks he's valuable, in what classroom, you know, what his life is less when looking down the face of a police officer. You know, the outcomes have to change. Yeah. And if we uphold a system that produces the same outcomes, yeah, we're all going to go insane, right? So we're in a place where the system has to change so that the outcomes change. We need to be intentional about those outcomes. So there are lots of other, we're so close. Jason, we have like 6 minutes. I can't believe it. What I want to be able to do is ask each panelist to, and I'm just trying to look through all the chat. There's so much happening in the chat. Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone who's part of this conversation. I want to spend the last 5 minutes asking the panelists to give us a message that they want to leave us with today. To give us the lasting message that they want people to take away in these next few minutes. And then we are going to, at the very end, audience, we're going to try to post a ton of resources in the chat. So just get ready, because we're just going to post all those resources in the chat. And I'm going to do it soon so that you can start copying them over and take advantage of these resources. In the meantime, I'd like to ask all of our panelists to, you know, spend a minute giving us a lasting thought for today.
If you've been in this conversation for a long time or have had generations of this conversation, stay encouraged. And if you're new to this conversation, welcome.
I would say, like I already said before, this is a marathon and not a sprint. There's going to be times, one of my students gave me the choir analogy when I was thinking about this, about how sometimes you have to stop singing, rest your voice for a second, but then join back in, because there's going to be other people who are in the choir that can carry that note for you. And so just realize that, you know, this isn't something that's going to be done instantly. It's not going to be done perfectly. And so we're all in the learning process. And my goal for you is to hopefully understand what your role is, to understand that, again, it's about the systems. It's not about hearts and minds. And so when you're trying to figure out how to address racist Uncle Bob at Thanksgiving, you know, it's great that you're trying to address him, but more than that, you want to make sure that what you're doing is going to carry through to the systems. And then the final thing would be, you need to address racism where it thrives. And so if your work is to go down into the Black neighborhood, that's not where it thrives. It's taking it back to your neighborhood, your churches, your schools, etc., and doing the hard work there. And when you face some of the opposition that you'll face, understand that that's just a fraction of what Black people have faced historically for 401 years in America. And so hang in there, we're all in this together.
I want to, Alex, you saying if you've been here, hang in, and you know, if you're new, welcome. I just want to highlight, thank you for modeling that. I think that that's so important for us white people, and the reminder, Heather, about the 401 years, because being, you know, honest, it's hard to not get antsy about my, you know, 5 years of activism. Like, okay, I've been here for 5 whole years, people, you know, and it's, I think staying humble is really, really important. And I would offer that what makes this hard for white people, what I have learned is that what makes this hard is also part of whiteness, right? So that fear that we were talking about before, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from me being part of friend groups and families and professional networks where somebody steps out of line, they get cut out, or they get undermined, or they get pushed to the side. Like, it's not completely irrational and just because we're all fraidy cats. Like, we have the ability to flex our privilege and be loud and bold in lots of different ways, right? But our conditioning around race is so broken, and that's part of it. And so for me, when I'm encountering that, I'm trying to dig deep into why is that, where does it come from, and how is that pushing past that barrier, not just something I have to get over, but I need to understand it better because it's actually part of the problem. So that's what I would offer. Mary, I'm so glad I wasn't last. Oh, you're muted.
You all have almost said it all. I think what I heard is this work is full of a lot of both ands. So we have to do the work now, even though we may not be around to see the end of it. That can't be part of the bargain that we make about getting the work done. We can never give up doing our own personal work. I tell people when they ask me, what's the timeline? Always and forever. So you've stepped in, you're not stepping out. If you're serious about this, you will keep your personal work going with some humility, as Adelaide said. And I don't want people to lose their sense of urgency at the same time. So yes, that's one of those both ands. I want you to have the sense of urgency. This is a moment. Let's not make it, let's not miss our shot. Let's get some mileage out of this. I hear a lot of disappointment from people that it's been 6 years since Michael Brown was murdered. It's 6 years St. Louis is still behind. So I say step up. This is the time you can step up.
Ooh, I'm gonna let Jason take us out because I have to take a deep breath and just say thank you again, humbly. Thank you, Jason.
You know, there's a great deal of value to sitting together and being in our discomfort and being in our questions, and to sit in the question is so valuable. And there's one thing that Mary put in the chat that I just want to touch on very briefly, is that comfort is a central value of the privilege. And I think figuring out, particularly as white people, how do we navigate our own discomfort? How do we figure out how we were socialized to silence what is uncomfortable, or silence what doesn't affirm our superiority without actually being racialized, as Adelaide was talking about. We actually are racialized people. I think it's really useful. So I do hope all of us who are attending and who are listening have an opportunity to really sit and think and be mindful about how to internalize this work, how to act on this work. And as a school leader, I will just remind all of us, this is maybe an aside that we may not have time for, I'm sorry, Atia, is that
No,
schools are responsible for your children.
Yeah.
So we might be responsible to the parent in some ways, particularly in an independent school, but we are responsible for your children. And so I say use whatever language you have. This idea of trying to soften language or come up with euphemism around it is harmful. It doesn't actually get us into difficult conversations, doesn't actually get us through the hard work of it. It doesn't actually inspire us to action. And so it sounds like there's a lot of requests to Tia for a further conversation, or how can we talk about this? And I have, and many of us probably have, strong opinions about how to move schools for this. Schools can be terribly norming in a way that we really don't want them to be. So I took that minute maybe in a way that you didn't mean to, Atia, but I do want to thank everybody who was here and listening and who was prompting in the chat. Those questions are so good. We always should return to those and be thoughtful about those. I always learn from the people that I know, which is 3/4 of the panel, and to people that I am coming to know, like Alex and Atia. And I think the candor, the passion, and the expertise you bring has been really useful to all of us. So thank you for spending an hour with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you all.